Welcome to the talk of the other old man who wants a chair. This really is, for me, this talk is really a kickoff, a kickoff for and to a campaign to establish freedom of transaction as a universal basic human right. I've been talking about freedom of transaction before, we all have. But I think there are steps to be taken for Bitcoin to become the global, permissionless, censorship-free hard money for humanity that we all want it to become. Laszlo's pizza purchase, the first physical thing bought for Bitcoin, of course, was an important step. There's many little steps on that way. The next step, I believe, were alpaca socks, the first physical good you could actually buy on the internet. Room 77 as the first establishment to accept, the first bricks and mortar establishment to accept Bitcoin, surely was a little step on that way. But where we want to go is ultimately global hard money and global unit of account. And there's a few more steps to be taken, quite obviously, to reach that. The connection of Room 77 to this talk is quite easy. Literally, since the first Bitcoin purchase at that bar, the toast at the bar used to be to freedom of transaction. So for 10, 12 years, people at that bar used that slogan as a toast. And I believe that on the way for Bitcoin to achieve this goal as global hard money, one necessary step is a discourse in society about freedom of transaction. Just been talking before, 15 minutes ago, to Aaron, and he used the term shifting the overton window, and that is exactly what it is. If we look at Bitcoin right now, it's in a certain frame. All the discussion is in a certain frame, and there is one absolutely basic thing that is outside of that frame. And what I'm trying to do is shift that frame to bring that thing, freedom of transaction, on the table. So, another thing, or one more thing, freedom of transaction is actually independent from Bitcoin, right? It's a human right, and Bitcoin is a tool. But then Bitcoin is the only tool we have to achieve freedom of transactions. Freedom of transaction. It's freedom of transaction, not transactions. For the simple reason that Bitcoin's inception is an unrepeatable story. It's a once in history event, in my opinion. While the whole shitcoin industry is literally there to make a very few people very rich at the expense of everybody else. Sorry for being this maximalist. Bitcoin is inherently a human rights project. I want to see it understood as a human rights project. There are plenty of examples that already now show how Bitcoin is protecting and promoting human rights. Do I need to mention Snowden, who used Bitcoin to anonymously pay for web servers to leak his stuff? Do I need to mention WikiLeaks, who we could send donations to when the banking system shut their accounts down? Do I need to mention Nigerian women's rights projects that can be funded with Bitcoin and nothing else, or dissidents and protest organizers elsewhere, who can only get funding with Bitcoin? It is inherently a human rights project. That is why I'm in here. I only realized that the other day again. This is the reason why I'm in here. And I think most, if not all, of the early Bitcoiners came to Bitcoin because they understood the potential for human rights that Bitcoin is delivering. I think I'm often being asked, how did you understand or how did you recognize or see Bitcoin so early? And my answer to this is that it took two things for anyone to, when Bitcoin turned up, have this wow Bitcoin moment that so many people have described that hit them when they understood what it is. And the one thing you needed to have understood was that there is an urgent need for a fair global financial system and a fair global hard money. That's number one. And the second thing you needed to have understood was that cryptography, Bitcoin, can deliver that. And it's this like the sum of people who had understood both. Those were the early people in Bitcoin. And they all were there for human rights reasons, not for speculating reasons and blah, 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 and so on. So I think to achieve freedom of transaction, we have only got one shot here. I really think we only got one shot, and that one shot is Bitcoin. If Bitcoin fails, there will be no trust in anything like cryptocurrency for 2 or 3 generations or anything like that. I strongly believe. If Bitcoin fails, the whole crypto universe will come down. If anything other in the crypto universe fails, nobody will give a shit, except the people who holding the bags. But the other way around. So this is one reason why I think we got only one shot. The other reason is that governments are aware now of that something like that can happen. It did not happen before Bitcoin. We had like 200 digital cash projects before Bitcoin. They all failed. They all were no threat because they all were centralized. Now we found technological ways to build that stuff in a decentralized way that cannot be attacked or is hard to attack, and governments have understood that. And if governments would have understood that already 10 years ago, Bitcoin would probably not be here anymore, and some of us would be sitting in jail. It's that easy. It's just gone too big and too many people before they realized they should crack down on it. By the way, there's a few cypherpunks here. There is a writing of one of the original cypherpunks where he describes that writing code is not enough, that you have to convince at least a certain percentage of your fellow human beings around you to apply that code. If I couldn't find it anymore, so if anybody here knows who I'm talking, is it? You sent me a link later. Thank you. So maybe it's time to clarify the underlying political, moral, ethical, and philosophical issues arising here at this moment. And I'm talking about a discourse and creating awareness and educate our fellow human beings, not about governments. This is not about how we convince governments, because we cannot convince governments about this. It's so easy. And talking about freedom, it is clear we are never being given any freedoms. We have to fight for freedoms. We had to fight for freedoms for hundreds of years. Once we achieve some freedom in our society, we have to defend it. Every day when we get out of bed, we have to defend our freedoms from the beginning again. And yeah, so I would like to see freedom of transaction to be recognized and established as a basic human right. And there is one suggestion that maybe you can throw on the screen. Freedom of transaction is the freedom of all people based on mutual voluntary action to carry out monetary transactions with any other person, without intermediaries, without the possibility of censorship, monitoring, or reversibility of transactions by third parties, and with free choice of the medium of exchange. That's a really important part of this. This is a suggestion. This is already undergoing rewording, and However, but as I said, I would like to start a discussion throughout society about this because it's literally not being talked about. You can wonder, why is it not being talked about? And I think it's funny, I was thinking, nobody ever fought for freedom of transaction. During all the times of revolutions, during all the struggles for human rights, nobody ever put freedom of transaction on the table. And it's actually funny, if you would have suggested freedom of transaction to be a basic human right 100 years ago, people would have laughed. They would have gone like, dude, you know, it's like demanding the freedom to breathe, or, you know, because we always had freedom of transaction. Ever since humanity is carrying out economic interactions, we had freedom of transaction, purely already due to the properties of the money we had so far. So when you think that through, other than other rights that people fought for, freedom of transaction is a right that was always there and that is slowly and ever faster fading away while we are moving into the digital realm. And so we are looking at an actual right that we had that is slowly disappearing, and the discussion and the discourse about this happening is what I believe is absolutely missing in our society. So rather than saying, I would like to establish a new human right, I would say this is the restoration, a reconstruction of a right that we had. Now, let me throw a legal disclaimer in here. I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert, so I have, and this talk serves for me to also ask questions that maybe other people have answers to inspire, to, as I said, put the topic on the table, move the Overton window. So, and that's, for example, at this point, we need lawyers to explain or research if freedom of transaction is maybe what's called a natural right. As far as I understand natural rights, they are rights that we have due to our human beings, because that's what we do. The right to self-defense. Nobody will ever take the right to self-defense away, because every judge will say, no, it's inherent to a human being to defend themselves physically if they're attacked. That's a natural right. So I could argue humanity would not exist if we would have not have at some point started to interact with each other economically. So I would claim that economic interaction, transaction, is an inherently human thing. But I may be wrong. That's why I'm putting this on the table, so people can discuss this and maybe find answers. So, point being, we are at a crossroads. Bitcoin offers us this opportunity as this, for this global censorship resistance, fair, inclusive hard money. And there's literally only one alternative on the other side, and that's called central bank digital currency, CBDC. Do I need to explain CBDC? Does everybody here understand what that means? Okay. In short, programmable central bank money issued and managed by a central government entity that can be sanctioned collectively and individually. You can sanction it collectively by deducting negative interest rates without asking anyone. You can censor it collectively by saying nobody can buy this or that with it. You can sanction it individually. We just had the discussion, you know, about pizza. Like, imagine your central bank digital currency wallet tells your health insurance that you're buying pizza for the third time this week, and your health insurance sends you a message, or no, your CBDC wallet actually tells you cannot buy this pizza because otherwise we'd have to increase your health insurance fees. Imagine wanting to go to a city where there are protests, and your central bank, your CBDC wallet tells you, no, you cannot buy this train ticket because we know there's protests in that city and we know that you are on the side of those protesters. Sorry, you cannot buy the plane ticket either, and the toll system on the Autobahn will stop you as well. And when I say there is no other alternative to Bitcoin than CBDC, then I mean there is no other alternative for it. Because, believe me or not, and you've heard it before, cash will be abolished. Central bank digital currency is the wet dream of every megalomaniac government person or financial regulator, and they can only use it if they abolish cash. Now, why do I know they abolish cash? I once was invited to the German Bundestag on a panel discussion discussing Bitcoin, and there was this, his name is Zimmerman, he's a member of the German parliament, and he said these words, because I was like, look, you guys are gonna abolish cash and we're gonna use Bitcoin instead, right? And this guy was like, nobody is intending to abolish cash. Now, that line in German has a very funny connotation. In German, it's niemand hat vor, das Bargeld abzuschaffen. And that is actually a quote from a very famous German politician from like 60, 70 years ago. And his words were, nobody is intending to build a wall. So if they are telling me, no, they are not intending to abolish cash, right. If you think that's too much conspiracy theory, just read all the papers of the IMF, of the World Bank. You have it black and white. It's their wet dream. They're literally saying that this offers so many new opportunities for steering and managing and whatever. Anyway, the question here is, why do we accept this to happen? Imagine we would have government bodies for the regulation of speech. Now, I know, of course, there are struggles in our society about censorship and so on, but there is no Western or modern democratic society that openly admits we have a regulator for speech. How about a regulator for assembly? You know, we need a regulator who decides who can assemble and associate with whom. How would we accept that? How about a regulator for opinion? Right? You see how absurd it gets. But nobody's talking about how absurd it is that we have regulators for our financial transactions. And this is then literally a point where you start understanding that freedom of transaction in the information age, in a digital economy, is not merely one of, we now have 30 articles in the Declaration of Human Rights. It's not merely yet another article. It is actually a meta-human right in the digital age. Without freedom of transaction, you lose all the rights and freedoms that people have been fighting for hundreds of years. Sounds maybe not so intuitively at first glance, but I'll read you some articles from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 17. Everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. Along with a few examples about CBDC that I just made you know that Article 17 of the United Nations Charter of Human Rights will be obsolete as soon as we have CBDC. Article 19, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. I mentioned WikiLeaks, I mentioned Snowden. Alex Gladstein has just tweeted about Chinese journalist lady living somewhere in the West researching human rights violations in Hong Kong, and she can only pay her researchers in Hong Kong with Bitcoin. That is exactly what this article of the human rights is about, gathering information, passing on information, and so on. This is gone with central bank digital currency in a world without Bitcoin. It's just gone. Article 20, everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. I just mentioned that. You cannot buy the plane ticket, you cannot assemble. It's that easy. So, without freedom of transactions, all these rights are de facto gone. They will not be abolished. Governments will give you more human rights, smiling at the same time, because they know we have the tool here in the background. We can just regulate away whatever we give you now in terms of rights. And I was making these assumptions about a regulator for opinion, a regulator of assembly, a regulator of speech. Financial regulators will de facto become regulators of opinion, of speech, of assembly, and all of that. We are going to get it. So, as I said, I would like to see a large-scale discussion about this topic. I see it coming. There is this Oslo Freedom Forum starting Monday, I believe. They have a whole track of about human rights and Bitcoin and so on. And I've been leading this discussion, and I found what I always try to do is to put myself into the shoes of my opponent in a discussion, and so I put myself into the pro-regulation pair of shoes, and I'm like, okay, why do we need financial regulation? And there's, of course, two main reasons why people will tell you, I think we need financial regulation, and their concerns are legit. These are not people, in the most cases at least, who are evil and want to take control over you. It's just normal people who are not into Bitcoin and who believe in benevolent government and who believe that government will do them good. And those two reasons are, of course, stop crime and protect consumers. Those are basically the two. So I want to take a look at those, right? Stop crime. The problem with trying to stop crime with financial regulation is that financial regulation will not stop at stopping crime. Do me a favor, Google Operation Choke Point. That was leaked. It's an operation by the banks in America, all working together. They have a list of about a dozen industries that are undesirable, not illegal. People have the absolute right to watch porn. People have the absolute right by now in many US states to smoke weed. But both are deemed undesirable industries by the banks, so they don't serve them. No access to the financial system for these undesirable industries, so let's weed them out. It's called Operation Choke Point, actually, right? So regulators will not stop at stopping crime or trying to stop crime. And I'm saying trying to stop crime because, on the other hand, stopping crime with financial regulation does not work. KYC, AML, know your customer, anti-money laundering tools. There is a plethora of information by now to be found online. How fucking useless financial regulation is in trying to stop crime. They have an estimated success rate between 0.01 and 0.1% of crime that is being caught or stopped by financial regulation, where on the other hand, the KYC AML implementations by now cost about 2% of our GDP. And I would clearly say, if you have a tool and let's give it there's an efficiency of 0.1%, you don't have a tool, just throw it out. Of course, there's another problem with having banks and financial regulators stopping crime, and that is banks and financial regulators are actually the biggest criminals themselves. At least when it comes to the amount of money they participate, or the amount of money of the crimes they participate in. Greatest example is HSBC. It's quite a couple of years ago. They were caught having laundered more than $100 billion for Sinaloa, a Mexican drug cartel that has killed about 10,000 people during that time. And they got a slap on the wrist. I think they paid $6 billion fine to the American government, which is like less than they made by laundering that money. And the highest state prosecutor of the United States stood in front of TV cameras and said, look, we cannot take these people to court, because if we do, we have to sue them for aiding 10,000 murders. And we cannot do that because they wouldn't survive that. So there's that. There is though quite an interesting intellectual challenge hidden here in the discussion about can we stop crime with financial regulation, and that is how to separate the crime from the transaction. My point of view is, a crime is a crime. No matter if you paid for it, no matter how you paid for it, it's got nothing to do with the transaction. Murder for hire hire for murder is a crime. It's a crime by the person who commits the murder. It's a crime by the person who pays the murderer. I don't need to sanction any transactions here. But as I said, I think this is quite an intellectual challenge, because this is the only right where we have, like, do I, with my right, step over the rights of anybody else? Because it is usually the balance that we're trying to make. And here is the next question that should be directed at lawyers. Maybe freedom of transaction needs to be what's called an absolute right. We have absolute human rights and not so absolute human rights. There's probably a more professional expression for not so absolute human rights. What do I mean? There's not to be subject to torture, not to be enslaved, your right to live. These are absolute human rights where courts, legal people say that it's absolute. You always have that. It cannot be reduced. There's other ones like freedom of speech, where they go like, okay, you know, you can say things that step over the rights of other people. So maybe we limit you here a bit. That's the difference between an absolute and a non-absolute human right. For example, in Germany, you can literally not say that soldiers are killers, because some court decided that that's too much of an insult to a soldier, even though it's a quote by a very famous German writer, Kurt Tucholsky. Okay, so there was Stop Crime, which, again, we will see these arguments made for financial regulation. The other one, big one, is consumer protection. What does consumer protection mean? Basically, the state wants to protect people from malinvestment. People invest their money into the weirdest things to lose their money, and there's usually two reasons. One is greed, and I'm not too sorry about people who lose their money because they're greedy, but the other one is desperation. There are people who are so poor They have only so little, and with that little that they cannot move, and their only chance is to put that little into something that multiplies their little, so they get some kind of economic air, and they throw their money at Luna, for example, or some shit like that. So Christine Lagarde has just yesterday tweeted about that. We need to protect consumers from these things. So I say it's legit. If somebody has the concern, how do we protect people, be they idiots or be they greedy, from, and we just had that, was it Amir's or was it Exile's talk? No, you were talking about it. Like, we cannot stop people from buying what they want. If they think they want to put their money into this bad investment, then we should allow them to. But again, it is a problem for many people who lose their money. Again, here, though, we have the problem that the people supposed to protect consumers, banks and financial regulators, mostly banks, are again exactly the people who herd people, consumers, into bad investments. From dot-com bubbles to subprime mortgages in Germany, the banks sent everybody into a retirement system named after a corrupt politician called Riester, and the banks made a fucking fortune. The state actually took tax money, threw it at the banks, and everybody who signed up for that, basically got screwed. So if a banker or financial regulator tells me that we need them to protect people from malinvestment and risky investments, then the answer is clearly, well, we cannot trust these guys either. So here is my only solution that I can find for how to protect consumers from malinvestment, and that is promote financial literacy, education, awareness. Funnily enough, no government is showing any motivation or action to actually educate people financially. It's actually the opposite. You can, in Germany, you can study economics, whatever. You can make an apprenticeship at a bank, and afterwards, you still not know why the euro is supposed to be worth anything. You can go to a banker, to your local banker, and ask him, why is the euro of any value? And he will explain you something about the gold reserves of the Deutsche Bundesbank, which have gone decades ago. There's people who claim that governments are trying to rather promote financial illiteracy than literacy. And I have this nice quote from Henry Ford, who said, if it's a good thing that the population does not understand our financial system, because if they would, there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. This is very often quoted. What's not quoted is what I found, is the next sentence he said. And I'm saying not tomorrow morning, but before tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, the most bankers would already be hanging on lampposts, right? So maybe we have some explanation there. So only solution for consumer protection, in my opinion, is education and financial literacy. Some of you have been to my talks before, so you may have heard the following. I got two more things here. One is kind of religious, the other one is kind of philosophical. The religious one, I'm just bringing it on the table because I find it so freaky. It's from the Bible, Revelation 13, 16 to 18. I'm reading the King James Bible version here. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he hit the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. I'm not a religious believer, but I find it absolutely freaky crazy how this is describing central bank digital currency. This is the number of the beast, in case you're interested. And I don't have any idea how this came to happen. I want to finish this talk with a little philosophic approach. Ludwig Wittgenstein, German philosopher and especially doing a lot of work about language. I changed one of his most famous quotes here a little bit. Ludwig Wittgenstein about Bitcoin. The limits of my transactions mean the limits of my world. He said the limits of my language mean the limit of my world, obviously meaning my world only reaches as far as I can understand the language that describes it to me, and as far as I can interact via language with other people. That's where my world ends. I claim where my transactional reach ends, that's where my world ends. And I wrote a few big words here that I'll just throw in. My transaction is my economic interaction with the others. Only from this interaction I can grow and be human. Only from these interactions we all can grow together and live our lives as humans to their fullest potential and build the best world possible for ourselves. Whoever limits the reach of my transaction does limit my humanity and my human rights, and limits my world, and violates everybody else's rights, and limits the world of everybody else. I'm bringing it in here because look, I'm an anarchist, I'm an egoist. As an anarchist, I'm always faced with the argument, but people are egoists, you know? How could egoists live together? I don't know if you guys know Max Stirner, German philosopher, founder of philosophical and political egoism. So whenever I'm in a situation where I go, okay, let me be egoist. Let me pretend I do not care about anybody else than me. What do I do now? In many cases, you realize that the best thing you can do for yourself is help your fellow human beings achieve a better life, a better standard, a better whatever. When everybody else is doing good, your chances of doing good are much better. But when it comes to freedom of transaction, this is so clear, much clearer than in any other talk, because the point is, if I'm the only so in the early days I was like, look, I don't give a fuck what other people do. I got my Bitcoin now. I got this cool currency now that we're always dreaming about. And I don't give a fuck what everybody, do the others like it as long as I have it, you know? But of course you realize that my freedom of transaction ends at the first person who doesn't have freedom of transaction. It's a literal single fax machine somewhere in the world, right? It's of no use to anyone if there's no second fax machine anywhere in the world. So, being a total egoist, I'm telling you, my transactions are my business and nobody else's business, but I can only have true freedom of transaction if everybody else has it too. And that's why I think we should be working on bringing that on the table of society, starting a public discourse about this, raising awareness about it. And that was it, and that's why I say cheers and freedom of transaction. Thank you for listening.